Howdy, and welcome to Howdies. I've had a few requests to show how I made the custom chest pieces. There are 3 major steps, so I wanted to cover each of them. In this first video, we'll cover the design tips. The second part will cover creating the silicone molds, and the final part will cover making the epoxy pieces themselves. If you haven't seen my review of the pressure tank, I recommend taking a few minutes as it will be helpful throughout the 3 steps. Welcome to Howdies. Before we begin, let me discuss what we are not going to be talking about today. We are not creating 2-piece molds that you may have to glue together. You may have seen some of these for sale on eBay or Etsy. Also, we are using a 3D printer to create the initial pieces that we're going to create the molds from, but note that they will not come out crystal clear and smooth. Even at the finest setting, a 3D printed piece will have some print lines on it, which once you make the molds themselves, it will create a slight pattern on the final pieces. Even though they will look great, and I guess you could polish them up after creation, the pieces I'll show you today will not be crystal clear on the surface. One other comment. Some ask, why not just use 3D printed pieces? Well, this works great, and you can do a lot more detail with straight 3D printing pieces. The drawback is that 3D prints are in most cases much too light for the likes of chess players. Although they might look great, they generally feel cheap because there's no weight to them. So can you add weight to them? Yes, but I've found it somewhat complicated in my experience. I tried adding ball bearings and even pennies to the inside of the 3D prints as they were being printed. And to avoid them from shaking around and jingling, I encased them in a silicone. Unfortunately, the printer I was using kept failing after I stopped the printing process to add the inserts. Now this could be because the added weight dropped the print plate a little bit, or it could be because some of the silicone I added spilled over on the sides of the print, causing the failure. Now I'm sure there's a good workaround, but in my experience, I kept having too many problems. Okay, enough of a detour. Let's get back to the design process. The first step is to find a design that you like, or if you can't find one, then you can have one designed for a fee. I'll cover both options. But first, let's go over some key requirements for the piece design. Keep in mind that the final pieces are going to be made out of an epoxy that is poured into a silicone mold. Then the pieces are pulled out once the epoxy hardens. For that reason, there are some guidelines that will make the epoxy work with the molds. First, no gaps in the pieces. For example, if you have a piece with 2 legs that are split apart at the base, this will keep the piece from being able to come out of the mold. Second, try to find something with a conical shape so it comes out of the mold a little bit easier. In theory, the top of the piece, should be more thin than the base of the piece. That way it will slide out of the molds easier. Third, try to avoid sharp edges since they will catch the mold and may damage it when it's removed. 4, avoid large angles in the piece. For example, any 90-degree angles on the piece will catch on the mold when being removed. An example of this is the ears on my knights. Sometimes those are difficult to get out of the molds, and I have to be very careful not to scratch my molds. Number 5, try to avoid any indentions in the pieces for the same reasons as above. Number 6, remember that small details are great, but they may not transfer to the final epoxy piece as well as you want. An example of this is the crown up at the top. And last, be careful of very thin parts. Remember that epoxy is a plastic, so if you have too thin of an area, it will bend. As I mentioned earlier, the crowns on my queens and kings are a key example of this. What I had to do eventually was fill them with clay when I made the molds to avoid having a piece that was too thin. Even with these guidelines, you can still find or develop some great designs. If you do want a pre-made one, there are some great websites like thangs.com or thingiverse.com. Just go to the website, do a search for chess pieces or chess sets, and download the option you like for 3D printing. If you do not have a 3D printer, you can also find a number of designs on Etsy, and some of the sellers might provide you a printed set. If you cannot find a set you like, you can use a third-party designer. This may cost more, but it can create a unique set just for you. This is what I did. I used a website called Fiverr, Fiverr.com. I created an account. I searched for providers that had experience in character design. I contacted a number of those designers that had good examples uploaded, and I provided them an example set that I liked. I also provided them my specs, the height, the width, and the guidelines that I had already covered above. Even after I received the designs, I had to make a number of corrections to smooth the pieces out. For example, the original king I had, the shoulders were way too broad. The piece would not have come out of the silicone mold, or it would have damaged the mold considerably when I pulled it out. The pawns also had very sharp gaps on the shoulders that we had to smooth over. The designer was great and corrected the pieces as requested. I believe all total I spent around $250 for all 6 pieces to be designed. Once they were designed to my liking, I bought an entry-level 3D printer and printed my pieces so that they would be ready for the molding process. Again, if you do not have a 3D printer, you can potentially ask the designer if they will print a set for you and send it. There may be an additional cost, but once you have a good quality set, you can create molds from it, and the molds you then can create multiple sets of pieces going forward. It's an investment. Now that you have your 3D prints, let's move to the second step, making the silicone molds. Before getting into the details of each step, let's do a quick overview of the mold process. First, you're going to use hot glue to glue a wood base to the bottom of your 3D print. You then attach that base to a piece of HDPE or plexiglass. Next, you hot glue a piece of PVC pipe over the 3D print, mix the silicone, and pour it slowly around the piece. Place the full set into the pressure chamber until the silicone is fully cured. Once dried, simply remove the base and hot glue, cut the PVC piping off, and remove your 3D print to leave the silicone mold ready to use. Simple enough, right? All right, let's go over it in a little more detail. The first step is to cut up some wood bases to glue the prints to. I use a wooden dowel rod and cut it into roughly 1/4-inch sections. Note, you can also use a more narrow base, like a 1/2-inch diameter, and this will use less epoxy and make sanding the excess off easier in a future step. I use my table saw and set up a stop block to make all the cuts at once. Next, you can cut the PVC tubing for the outside. When cutting this, the general rule is to make sure it is wide enough to leave about an 1/8-inch gap around the widest part of the 3D print, and long enough to cover the wood base, the 3D print, and also about an additional inch or 1.5 inches over the top of the print. Again, I use my table saw for these cuts and use a stop block to make sure that all the cuts were made at the same time and were made in the correct length. Make sure the cuts have very clean edges, as they will be glued down to the HDPE. Now that all the cuts are made, it's time to assemble the bases, the print, the tubing, all with hot glue. I let the glue gun heat thoroughly, then glued the wooden base solidly to the HDPE and also the 3D print then to the wooden base. Make sure that there is enough glue to attach the parts securely with no gaps, but you also do not want any glue to seep out from the edges, as that will cause a bump in the final mold. If there is glue seeping out, you can clean it up with a razor blade. For the PVC tubing, I put hot glue carefully along the edges. Note there should be just enough to secure it to the HDPE base, but not enough again to seep out. Be very careful as you are placing the tubing onto the HDPE base. You're going to be putting it over your 3D print, and you need to make sure that none of the glue on the bottom of the PVC touches the 3D print and gets stuck to the 3D print. If that happens, your 3D print will look like it's deformed, and you'll have to clean the glue off and start over. Also, make sure that there is enough room around the tubing and the 3D piece. The PVC should not be touching the 3D print, or the silicone will not be able to fill that space. The PVC tube also should have a gap between it and the wood base that your 3D print is sitting on. If you want to test how much silicone is needed, you can fill the gap with the water and then pour it into your mixing cup. Just note that you need to be careful doing this, as water will swell the wooden base and it might cause the glue to come off or the piece to come unattached. At this point, you can mix up your silicone. A quick note on what silicone to use. Silicone comes in a number of forms, with each having a various hardness once dried. This is measured in what's called the Shore scale. There are a number of categories. There's OO, there's A, there's D, and each one of those has a range of numbers from 0 to 50 or more. What we want is a silicone that is very flexible so the final epoxy pieces can be removed, but it's sturdy enough to stand up on its own while the epoxy is drying and being poured in. After experimenting, I chose the one in the upper left from Amazon. It has a Shore value of A6 to A-8. I believe the name was called BBDINO Super Elastic Silicone Mix. Note that the video that you'll see shows a different mix because I ran out of the BBDINO mix when making the video. It's not blue, it will be the green color. Okay, back to the process. Mix up your silicone per the instructions and then carefully pour it around the edges, allowing it to fill in all the gaps around the 3D print. Remember to pour slowly to avoid any bubbles. I recommend adding enough silicone to not only cover the piece, but add another 1 to 1.5 inches over the top of the piece. This extra is needed because in some cases your 3D print may have gaps, and when you put it in a pressure tank, the silicone will be pulled into those spaces inside of the piece. So you need to have enough silicone where if it gets pulled into the 3D print, there is still enough on the top to cover the entire piece. Before it cures too much, place the 3D print into the silicone into a pressure chamber and make sure it is fully closed. I usually pressurize it anywhere from 40 to 50 psi. That's plenty for this. And then you let it sit there until fully cured. A quick tip, I generally leave a little bit of the silicone in the mixing cup so that I know when the silicone is fully cured. When the cup remnants are fully cured, then you are likely good to pull the pieces out of the pressure chamber. Once cured, let the pressure out of the chamber and you can remove the silicone mold. Now it's just a matter of getting your prized mold out of the PVC and out of the base without damaging it. I first very carefully removed the HDPE, using a hammer. It should come off pretty easily, but if you need to, you can use a hammer to try and get it off. I removed the remaining hot glue around the edges of the PVC tubing so that it will lay flat. I then measured the width of the PVC wall and I raised my table saw blade just to that depth. Using my table saw, I carefully ran the PVC tubing across the blade so that it cut only the PVC wall and does not cut into the mold itself. I usually make 2 cuts, one on the top side and one on the bottom side, and that makes it easy to pull the PVC off of the silicone mold. I then use an X-Acto blade to cut the wooden base from the 3D print, making sure not to cut into the edges of the silicone mold. This edge of the mold will hold the epoxy later, so you want to make sure that the sides are not cut or your epoxy will spill out. At this point, I roll down the edges of the silicone mold carefully using the palms of both hands until the 3D print is free and can be removed. Once the 3D piece is removed, you have your final silicone mold ready to be used. Congratulations! Now just repeat this process for the other 15 chest pieces, or if you're making a full set, for the other 31 pieces. So I've had some requests to show how I make the chest pieces. The molds are critical in being able to make multiple sets of chest pieces. Eventually what I did is made 2 sets of these molds. I've got another set over here. And what that allows me to do is to use this little thing where I can basically put an entire set on the top, an entire set on the bottom, and fit it into my pressure chamber. And that allows me to make 2 full sets at one time. So basically in 24 hours, the time it takes to cure the epoxy, I'm able to make an entire set of chest pieces. So once you make your molds, one thing you want to do is pull them all out, and I actually fill them with water and then dump the water into this measuring bin, and that allows me to know exactly how much of the epoxy I need so that I don't use too much or waste it. One tip is that you can also keep an extra mold around. That way, if you ever do get to the end and you have a little bit of extra, you can go ahead and throw it in and make an additional piece. I've already measured these out. I know that it takes 25 ounces of epoxy, so I mix up 26 ounces. What I'm doing today is making 2 white sets, and the reason is because I already have 2 black sets, so these will be the complementary pieces. All right, so first parts first. You want to mix up your epoxy. If you're an idiot, you'll try and pour before taking the top off.
Looking for 13 ounces.
Now you want to mix up the part B. This is actually part A. I set them backwards. The other part of your epoxy.
And this is a 50-50 by volume. So I want to go up to 26. One thing I've noticed is I like to put the more viscous liquid in first, the thinner one, because that helps mix it up. If you put the heavier, thicker version of your epoxy down on the bottom, then when you pour the lighter epoxy in,
makes it really difficult to mix it well. As I said, I'm using eye candy Soma to make a couple of white pieces. Very important to mix this thoroughly. Get all the sides and all the pigment clumps out. I'm looking for clumps of the epoxy. If I see any, I want to break those up. This epoxy has about a 30 to 40 minute working time, so that gives me plenty of time to mix up 2 full batches and get them onto my panel here and get them into the pressure chamber. And if you need to, you can add a little more pigment to make sure that your pieces have the opacity that you want. All right, once that's done, you probably want to do this first. I already did it, but just to let you know, you blow out each piece just to make sure there's no little bits of dust or anything else that's in there. So at this point, just a simple pour down to the bottom. If you want to squeeze it a little bit, that'll help catch any bubbles, make sure they come to the top. But it hasn't really been a problem for me once we've been using the pressure chamber. The bubbles have not been an issue at all. All right, so once you've got them done, what I do is put them on this little tray. We're gonna put these on the bottom, assuming it fits. This is my tallest piece. Nope, we're gonna put these on the top. I put the larger, taller pieces on the center when I'm balancing them out. Picking up and getting all of these down in there without spilling. I start with it closed.
If you're using an epoxy for the first time, one you haven't used before, what I recommend doing is pouring any excess. So I had a little bit of excess left over into another mold, or you can just pour it into, basically leave it in the container. And you can check and make sure when this is solid and when this is dried and cured completely, that means that more than likely the ones in your pressure chamber are also ready to be taken out.
Once the epoxy is fully cured, you release the pressure on the pressure chamber and take out the pieces. To remove the pieces from the mold, I place both my palms along the top edge of the mold and I roll the sides down. I then use a finger to break the seal between the mold and the epoxy piece and remove the piece. The next step is to sand off the excess epoxy at the bottom of each piece. Make sure you use proper breathing protection, as this sanding creates a lot of epoxy dust. Make sure you're wearing a mask. Also, make sure you sand the bases evenly. I generally try and stop halfway through and set the piece down to make sure it's standing straight up. I also like to clean the pieces once the sanding is done. Generally, I just use warm water and a little bit of soap if needed. You can then dry them so they are ready for the final step. The last step is adding the felt to the bottom. I found some thin felt with an adhesive already included on Amazon. I simply cut the strips of the felt that were wide enough to cover the full diameter of the base of the chest pieces. I then removed the covers and placed the pieces down along the strip, making sure that the felt was securely attached. Using scissors, I cut all the pieces apart and then went back and trimmed all around the piece so that the felt did not stick out from the bottoms. Just a quick note and a reminder, if you're making pieces for a light-up chest set, you would skip adding felt to the bottom, otherwise it'll block the light. Other than that, you are all done. Congratulations on making your own custom chest sets, and thanks for sticking around until the end. I love likes and follows, so please subscribe. I'm almost up to 350 subscribers. And I enjoy the comments as well, both positive and constructive. Remember, this channel is meant to be a learning opportunity for me and any viewers. Thanks again for joining me, and hope to see you soon. Until next time, howdy's away.